He smiled after the last bite, said it was his favorite. She watched him with a look no one at that table would forget. The next morning, he was gone. But this isn't the story you think it is, because the real victim was her. Sometimes the warning signs are quiet: a text, a bruise, a silence that lasts just a little too long. But Ruth Baker tried to speak. She left behind a trail of fear, of desperate hope, of quiet courage. And what happened next didn't just destroy one family. It exposed something darker, something so many people still ignore until it's too late. The evening was quiet, almost peaceful. Just the soft hum of the television in the background and the clinking of cutlery on plates. Ruth Baker had spent the afternoon preparing George's favorite meal, homemade stew with soft bread rolls and a side of his favorite pickles. He said it reminded him of childhood, said it calmed him down. But something about that night felt off. Ruth's hands trembled just slightly as she served the plates. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her two youngest children were at the table too. She tried her best to act normal, to keep the mood light, but behind her eyes was something else. She had sent a message earlier that day, just a few words. If anything happens to me, it was George. That message didn't get read until the next morning. By then, it was too late. Ruth was found in her home, beaten and strangled. The man she had loved, the man she had feared, was gone. George Chalmers, a name that would soon be splashed across every headline. A man with a violent past. A man who had fooled neighbors into thinking he was charming, quiet, helpful. But behind closed doors, there were holes in the walls, broken locks, police reports that were never followed up. Ruth had tried to protect her children, to keep the peace, to stay alive. And yet, the truth was, she had seen it coming. She told people, not always with words, but with glances, with pauses, with fear. Why didn't anyone act fast enough? And what made her stay? It didn't start with violence. It never does. At first, George just seemed intense. He wanted to know where Ruth was all the time. Said it was because he cared. He didn't like when she went out with friends, didn't like when she wore makeup, didn't like when she didn't answer the phone on the first ring. And slowly, Ruth stopped doing those things. He would apologize after yelling, bring flowers, cook dinner. For a while, it felt like maybe things would get better. Maybe he was just stressed. But behind closed doors, the pressure was building. Ruth's friends noticed she was quieter. Her mother said she didn't laugh the way she used to. And then came the first mark, a small bruise covered with foundation. I tripped, she said. We've heard that one before, haven't we? The children never said much, but children see more than we think. Ruth's daughter once told a school counselor she didn't like loud nights. When asked what she meant, she went quiet. One neighbor remembered hearing yelling late into the night. Another said they once saw Ruth in the hallway, clutching her arm and looking shaken. But when asked if everything was okay, she smiled, said she was just tired. It's easy to look back and say, why didn't anyone do something? But in real life, signs are easy to miss or easier to ignore. What would you do if someone you knew seemed afraid to go home? Because Ruth had stopped inviting people over. Her texts became shorter, the sparkle in her eyes gone. And yet, she stayed. George Chalmers wasn't new to this. He had a past quiet, buried, but there. An ex-girlfriend once filed a complaint after he threw a chair during an argument. No charges were ever filed. A bar fight ended with someone needing stitches, but again George walked away free. He knew how to talk his way out of trouble, knew how to flip the story. Ruth wasn't his first target, just the one who stayed the longest. And here's the tragic truth: she stayed because she believed he could change, or maybe she stayed because she didn't see a way out. She told a friend, "It's not always bad. Sometimes he's so gentle, it's like he's someone else." But that someone else didn't stay for long. The night before her death, Ruth sent a string of messages to a close friend. They started simple: "He's acting strange." Then, "He's calm but too quiet. That scares me more than when he's loud." And finally, "If something happens, promise me you'll tell the police everything. He's not who they think he is." That friend didn't see the messages until the next morning, and by then, Ruth was gone. The final one just read, "He's eating now. I'm scared." What was it about that dinner that made her feel the end was near? Was it the way he looked at her? Or was it the way he was too calm? Sometimes silence is more terrifying than screams. The house was strangely quiet, too quiet. A neighbor noticed the lights were still on. One of the children had wandered outside, barefoot, clutching a toy, confused, dazed. When officers arrived, they found Ruth in the living room, lifeless, marks on her neck, bruises that told a silent story. The scene didn't scream chaos, it whispered something colder, planned. George was nowhere to be found. His phone was off, his car gone, but the dinner plates were still on the table, half eaten. And Ruth's phone, still unlocked, still showing the last messages she had sent, messages that now read like a will. George Chalmers didn't run far. In fact, he didn't even try to hide. He was found later that day sitting on a bench outside a small train station, drinking coffee like nothing had happened. When police approached, he asked, "Is this about Ruth?" Not what happened or is she okay, just, is this about her? He didn't resist, didn't speak much on the way to the station, and when asked what happened, he said he didn't remember. He claimed they had argued, that she was upset, that maybe she fell. But investigators had already seen the bruises, the pattern, the messages. This wasn't just a fall. This wasn't just a bad night. This was murder. During interviews, the oldest child, barely a teenager, spoke up, hesitantly, quietly, said they heard loud voices the night before, something slamming, then silence. Said they peeked into the living room and saw Ruth on the floor, George standing over her, breathing heavily. Then he told them to go to bed, said everything was fine. Imagine carrying that memory. Imagine waking up and realizing your mother is gone and the person responsible was supposed to love her. It was the children's statements that confirmed what investigators feared. This wasn't sudden rage. This was the end of a long, terrifying road. The courtroom was packed. Ruth's family sat in the front row, holding each other's hands so tightly their knuckles turned white. George Chalmers stood just feet away, calm, clean-shaven, wearing a pressed shirt and a blank expression. He pleaded not guilty, claimed it was an accident, claimed he lost control, claimed he loved her. But love doesn't leave bruises. Love doesn't silence messages crying for help. The prosecution painted a chilling picture: years of control, fear, and manipulation that ended in a final, deadly outburst. And the defense? They tried to say Ruth was emotional, that she pushed his buttons, that it wasn't premeditated. But then came the texts. The messages Ruth sent in her final days became the heart of the case. She had written about her fear, about feeling watched, cornered. She described George's shifts in mood, how he'd go from laughing to yelling in seconds. One message read, "I don't think I'll make it to next week." Another, if anything happens to me, don't believe it was an accident. Those texts echoed through the courtroom like thunder. Each word hit harder than the last. And then there was her journal, found tucked in a drawer, pages filled with pain. She had documented everything: dates, times, fights, promises, regrets. It was like she knew one day someone would need to read it. The jury didn't need long. After just a few hours, they returned with a verdict: guilty. George Chalmers was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 17 years behind bars. 17 years. A small number compared to what Ruth lost, what her children lost. When the verdict was read, Ruth's mother wept, not just for justice, but for all the times her daughter smiled through the pain. George didn't flinch. He just stared ahead as if none of it applied to him. But the world now knew who he really was, and Ruth's voice had finally been heard. The courtroom was empty now. The cameras were gone. The headlines faded. But for Ruth's family, every day still carried her absence. Her mother took in the children, raised them with quiet strength, kept Ruth's photos on the wall, told stories about her laughter, her cooking, how she used to dance while folding laundry. The kids struggled at first: nightmares, silence, fear of sudden noises, but they had each other. And most importantly, they had the truth. They knew their mother had tried, had fought, had left behind a voice even in her final hours. But the question still haunted them: why wasn't she saved in time? At Ruth's funeral, her sister stood before a small crowd, voice shaking, eyes full. She said one thing: this doesn't end here. That wasn't a hope, it was a promise. Ruth's story became the beginning of something bigger. Her family began speaking out about domestic violence. They held talks at schools, joined awareness campaigns, partnered with local shelters. They said, if someone tells you they're scared, believe them. And they showed Ruth's final messages because those texts might save another life. One teacher said a student came forward after hearing Ruth's story. Another woman said it gave her the courage to leave. Even in death, Ruth was still reaching people. Looking back, the signs were there. Friends said Ruth seemed tired all the time, that she had stopped going out, that she once changed her phone number and didn't explain why. She had started wearing long sleeves in summer, smiled too quickly when asked how things were at home. It's easy to miss those signs when we're not looking for them. But now her story is a reminder. Domestic abuse doesn't always look like screaming. Sometimes it looks like silence, like someone pulling away, like someone saying, I'm fine, too many times. How many others are living in fear right now, just waiting for someone to ask the right question? This is the part no one wants to say out loud. Yes, it could have been prevented. There were police visits, complaints that were closed too soon, a warning from a neighbor that went nowhere. Even Ruth's own texts filled with fear weren't enough to trigger urgent action. And that's what hurts the most. Ruth was not silent. She didn't keep it all inside. She tried. But the system was slow, disconnected. One officer didn't know what another had seen. One caseworker retired and the file went cold. By the time her final message was sent, it was already too late. How many more women are sending messages like that right now? George Chalmers was never a stranger to violence. His past was full of red flags, outbursts at jobs, threats to exes, a need for control that never faded. And yet, he moved through life quietly, politely. He said the right things, made people think Ruth was lucky to have him. He smiled at neighbors, helped carry groceries, even volunteered once at a food drive. But behind closed doors, that same smile became something else. It became the face of control. That's what makes people like him so dangerous, they know how to hide. And by the time you see who they really are, it's already begun. Today, Ruth's name is part of something bigger. A foundation started in her memory now helps victims of domestic abuse find safe housing, legal support, and therapy. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, people gather not just to mourn, but to take action. They read her messages aloud, share her story with schools and communities, and they ask one question over and over again. What would you do if Ruth was your sister, your daughter, your friend? Her voice is still here, still speaking, still saving lives. And that may be the most powerful thing of all. You don't just heal from something like this. Not really. For Ruth's children, there's no simple way to explain what happened. No bedtime story soft enough to erase what they saw. No calendar page that flips and suddenly makes it okay. They grow up knowing that love can hurt, that sometimes the person who's supposed to protect you is the one you fear the most. They carry pieces of that night in ways they may not even understand yet. The sound of silence after yelling, the fear of footsteps in the hallway, the empty seat at dinner. And for Ruth's mother, imagine waking up every day knowing your daughter warned the world and the world didn't listen fast enough. She holds onto the journal, reads Ruth's handwriting, sometimes out loud, sometimes in silence. The pages are filled with more than just memories. They are filled with everything Ruth tried to say before the world noticed her pain. She had dreams. She wanted to go back to school, start her own small bakery, watch her kids grow up without fear. And now, all that's left are what ifs. But here's what still burns. Ruth did everything victims are told to do. She reached out, she wrote it down, she tried to survive. So why wasn't it enough? This story doesn't end with a prison sentence, or a courtroom, or even with Ruth's last message. It ends every time someone turns away from a friend who seems quieter than usual. It ends every time someone hears shouting next door and chooses not to call. It ends every time a victim is told, just leave him, without understanding how much that costs. But it can also begin again, with you, with all of us. Because Ruth's story isn't rare, it's not unique, that's the horror. Every week, in cities and towns around the world, someone sends a message like hers. And some of those messages are never read in time. So ask yourself this. Who in your life might be sending silent signals right now? And if they are, will you be the one who listens? Because sometimes the difference between tragedy and survival is one person who refuses to look away. If someone you know seems scared, ask twice. If something feels off, don't wait. Ruth tried to speak. This time, let's be the ones who listen.